Let us pray. We give thanks to God for the rich heritage of this province as found in our people. We pray that native-born Albertans and those who have come from other places may continue to work together to preserve and enlarge the precious heritage called Alberta. Amen.
Introduction of visitors. Presenting petitions.
The Assembly signed by 32 members of the Idlewild Parents Association in Edmonton Gold Bar constituency. These members request that the Minister of Education give consideration to restoring education funding to its 1986 level. Thank you.
Reading and receiving petitions. Presenting reports by standing and special committees. Notices of motions. Introduction of bills.
Edmonton Calder.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I request leave to introduce Bill 219, the Children's Rights Act. This bill establishes all children's rights to the basic necessities of life and to education, recreation, parental support, and consultation at and explanation of any proceedings affecting the child's guardianship, custody, or determination of status.
The honourable member for Edmonton Calder has moved first reading of Bill 219, Children's Rights Act. Those willing to give assent to first reading, please say aye. Opposed, please say no. Carried.
Bill 219, being Children's Rights Act, introduced by Honourable Member Ms. Melsness, is now read a first time.
Member for Edmonton Glengarry, followed by Calgary Forest Lawn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I request leave to introduce a bill being Bill 225, the Clearwater Alberta Act. The bill would require any person supplying drinking water to the public to make sure the water being supplied is safe and would provide for fines of up to $50,000 in the event of violations.
The honourable member for Edmonton Glengarry has moved first reading of Bill 225, Clearwater Alberta Act. Those in favour, please say aye. Opposed, please say no. So ordered.
Bill 225, Clearwater Alberta Act, introduced by Honourable Member Mr. Uni, is now read a first time.
Calgary Forest Lawn.
Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to introduce Bill 223, the Alberta Plus Corporation Act. This bill would create the Alberta Plus Corporation, a Crown corporation intended to coordinate the marshalling and implementation of projects to develop Alberta's tar sands and heavy oil resources, primarily through participating in joint ventures with private sector companies. The corporation would be funded initially through a $1.5 billion transfer from the Heritage Savings Trust Fund.
The honourable member for Calgary Forest Lawn has moved for first reading Bill 223, Alberta Plus Corporation Act. Those in favour of first reading, please say aye. Opposed, please say no. Carried.
Bill 223, being Alberta Plus Corporation Act, introduced by Honourable Member Mr. Pashak, is now read a first time. Tabling returns and reports.
of Agriculture.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to file copies of a press release that we just released indicating the extension of the Farm Fertilizer Protection Program.
Provincial Treasurer.
Mr. Speaker, I request leave to file answer to motion for return 182.
Minister of Consumer and Corporate Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, I have the honour of tabling the 15th annual report of the Alberta Automobile Insurance Board, this one covering the year ending December 31, 1986.
Introduction of special guests.
Edmonton Centre.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to introduce to you and through to members of the Assembly 26 adult students from the Careers Program, Business Careers Program at the Alberta Vocational Centre in Edmonton Centre. They are accompanied by their teacher, Mrs. Margaret Penrose, and they are seated in the public gallery. I'd ask if they please stand and receive the warm welcome of the Assembly.
Calgary Northwest, followed by Edmonton Belmont.
Mr. Speaker, it's my pleasure today to introduce to you and through you a group of very special grade 6 students who are in the French immersion program at Varsity Acres Elementary School. They are accompanied by 3 teachers, Mrs. Heather Woodward, Mrs. Carol Hender, and Madame Anne-Marie Delis, as well as 2 parents, Mrs. Emery and Mrs. Anne McLaren. I would ask that they now rise and accept the customary applause of this assembly. They are seated in the members' gallery.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I'd like today to introduce to you and to all members of the Assembly some 26 students, grade 6 students from the North Edmonton Christian School. They're accompanied by 3 teachers, Mr. Princeton, Mr. Taylor, and Mrs. Furnout, and by 2 visitors from South Africa, Mr. Speaker, Mr. and Mrs. Reswick. They're seated in the public gallery, and I'd ask that they rise and receive the traditional welcome of the Assembly.
Edmonton Millwoods.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to introduce to you and to the members of the Assembly this afternoon a theatrical group from Nicaragua, the Teo Hoyani Nicaraguan Popular Theater Company, which is in our city here in Edmonton from June 16th to the 19th as part of a national tour. They're in the members' gallery with several members of my staff and constituents who have acted as translators for us while they're here. I'd like them to please rise and receive the warm welcome of the House.
Ministerial statements. Oral question period.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to direct the first question to the Minister of Social Services. Mr. Speaker, 2 women's shelters in Calgary have begun closing their beds because the government has not provided sufficient funds to operate them. Mr. Speaker, this regrettable action from the Minister has resulted from the Minister's failure to respond to representation from women's groups, the official opposition, and even members of her own caucus. Mr. Speaker, at least some of them seem to be aware of the unfairness of the government's action. My question to the Minister, has the Minister decided to acknowledge the validity of the representation she has received and recognize the government is just not providing enough funds for battered women?
Mr. Speaker, as has been noted in this House on many occasions, every single social program that one might look at, there is good reasons made as to why more funding would be useful. As to whether the taxpayers can ultimately afford to continue to fund the programs to the extent that we would like is an altogether different question. And, Mr. Speaker, in relationship to what is going on across the country, the funding for shelters in Alberta, although all of us might wish it were higher, is certainly among the best in the country.
Mr. Speaker, the taxpayers will pay a lot more in the long run because of this short-sighted approach. And my question simply to the Minister, women and children are paying the price for this Minister's uncaring action. My question is, flowing from the Minister's answer, what advice then would this Minister give to the victims of abuse if they can't find a bed at the shelter? Just what are they supposed to do?
Mr. Speaker, emergency social services is always available to those who obviously should leave a battering condition.
Mr. Speaker, so then you'll send them to the hotel with no counseling and we'll pay more money. That makes a lot of economic and social sense, Mr. Speaker. My question flows from that, Mr. Speaker. I noticed in Calgary last year, even before the cuts, 2,306 women were turned away from overcrowded shelters. Edmonton isn't much better. 669 were turned away in Edmonton. And my question is this, Mr. Speaker. How can this government justify this cruel approach to the victims of abuse? How can they justify this short-sighted approach?
Mr. Speaker, if the government of Alberta is short-sighted in this case, I must say that the government of Manitoba is short-sighted by almost another 50%.
Mr. Speaker, that's the type of answer that we expect from this government. There's people that are suffering right out here in Alberta right now. It's not how much you spend. There's a need for this service, Mr. Speaker. And how can this minister then stand here in this chamber and say the government is providing enough funds to operate emergency shelters when we have people being turned away all over the province?
Mr. Speaker, there are many communities that, for instance, provide crisis line opportunities for people who, by way of the telephone, have an exchange that apparently helps them a great deal. I have spoken to a number of people in rural areas where this has been in effect. But, Mr. Speaker, it is important to say that there is the crisis services available in the major centres. And I'm not sure why women haven't been accessing that to a greater degree. It is certainly available, and it is crisis. Mr. Speaker, it is available. I think that by somehow presenting the idea that the shelters are the only place where someone, regardless of what their problem is, has a crisis at a particular moment, can't go anywhere else but to a shelter. That's just not so.
Edmonton Gold Bar, followed by Calgary Foothills.
Mr. Speaker, we all suffer in this deplorable circumstance. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask the minister, when will the minister address the whole issue and provide for interventions to be made with identified abusers so that we really make this program work?
Mr. Speaker, the honourable member makes an excellent point. As a matter of fact, it is one that is now being looked at very carefully by the Council of Women's Shelters. After a meeting in Ottawa, the President had said to me that it was obvious that while the housing was important as a crisis intervention, if you will, addressing the problem was most important. And that is ongoing. I'm hoping that within the next several months, the department, along with service organizations in this province, will have an announcement to make.
Calgary Foothills.
Mr. Speaker, my question to the minister, what steps are being taken to address the funding problems?
Mr. Speaker, I'm not sure whether the honourable member is at this point referencing the Calgary situation. Obviously, from what I understand, Calgary believes that they are underfunded in relationship to the other shelters. The funding model, as I had said before, had been evolved and accepted by myself. I take that responsibility and would certainly entertain, as a result of the review that they're doing, any suggestions for change.
Second main question, Leader of the Opposition.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to direct the second question to the Minister of Labour responsible for the Human Rights Commission. Mr. Speaker, the minister must be aware that the automobile insurance industry, as it's run in this province, discriminates against a number of Albertans by reason of age, sex, and marital status. Mr. Speaker, if he's been paying attention, he will also know that the Minister of Consumer and Corporate Affairs takes the side of industry on this matter, and he's expressed her view very clearly that industry can do whatever it likes, at least so far as the Individual Rights Protection Act is concerned. My question to the Minister of Labour, has the Minister of Labour addressed this question in his capacity as the Minister responsible for human rights legislation, and if so, can he update us on what his stand is in this matter?
Mr. Speaker, it is my understanding the current exemption under the Individual Rights Protection Act expires at the end of this month. It is not currently our intention to renew that exemption.
Mr. Speaker, I'm glad the Minister answered that. So that particular clause, July the 1st, I believe, since it came in during a few years ago, it's been renewed. The Minister is saying, so I understand then, that that clause will not be renewed come July the 1st then.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, and I think the Minister of Consumer and Corporate Affairs did indicate that a couple of weeks ago.
Mr. Speaker, that's not correct. She didn't. But, Mr. Speaker, to flow along from the Minister's answer then, as he's aware, 3 former chairs of the Alberta Human Rights Commission have recently expressed their concern about the government's lack of action on the gouging of young drivers in particular. My question to the Minister then, will the Minister state whether then, in view of the fact that they're not going to renew this, that he will now be pressing that we will bring in laws dealing with the Human Rights Commission that will eliminate that discrimination in those three areas.
Mr. Speaker, I think the Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition is confusing the word discrimination and what it means. If indeed a group of drivers who can be clearly identified have a much higher incidence of accidents and those accidents are more costly, then it is not discrimination to say that those people should pay higher premiums necessarily. There is in the Individual Rights Protection Act the test of reasonableness, and I presume that that is the test that will be applied to this matter.
A supplementary question then to the Minister. The Minister then is saying very clearly then that he believes that people should be discriminated against by virtue of their age and their marital status and their sex, and that he has no intention as Minister responsible for the Human Rights Commission to do anything about this.
As the saying used to be in Yorkshire, "Nowt at sort," which on translation into English means nothing of the sort. The situation is that if there is a clearly identified group of people, identifiable, who have a higher accident rate, it is not necessarily discrimination that they pay the premiums to pay for the results of their driving habits.
Supplementary question, Westlock. Supplementary information, Minister of Consumer and Corporate Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, it might just be worthwhile adding once again, only this time referring to the annual report of the Automobile Insurance Board, that the section that is in our Individual Rights Protection Act is similar to that in an Ontario statute. The section in our Act reads that discrimination in reasonable and justifiable circumstances is permitted. On virtually the same language, there has been a judicial interpretation of a case of a young man with automobile insurance in Ontario, and the divisional court there has decided that it was indeed discrimination that was permitted under that human rights legislation. That case is now proceeded to the Court of Appeal in Ontario, and it would seem to me that when a court gives an interpretation of a statute, that opinion is well worth listening to.
Westlock Sturgeon, supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like a supplemental to the Minister of Consumer Affairs. It's a little confusing, although I know I'm not allowed to speak French, but the Gaelic or Latin that our Minister of Labour uses is a little bit difficult to follow, so I'll try out the Minister of Consumer Affairs instead. If indeed this part of the Act, I hope you don't spring it on me, if indeed that part of the Act is going to not be reinstated in the first next month, as the Minister of Labour said, will the Minister use powers at her discretion to as I understand it, then go to court to try to see whether or not the insurance companies are within their rights by charging extra, rather than sitting back and waiting for other provinces? Will we fund a suit ourselves to see whether or not it's discriminatory under our human rights legislation after the changes next month?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I thought reference had been made to the Yorkshire, not the Gaelic earlier, but and indeed my Irish isn't up to use in the Assembly. Mr. Speaker, I wouldn't be intending to take such a case to the courts at this stage. I think it's well worth waiting for the court action in Ontario. I am told that there is some expectation that the case may indeed progress from the Ontario Court of Appeal to the Supreme Court of Canada, and that, of course, is a court that would have a binding effect on our own Alberta courts. I might add that another paragraph in the annual report states that it is only with respect to gender that there is any question of the industry being in contravention, and it is that question that we are watching the case in Ontario for. And I might add also that the industry has been encouraged by the board to develop statistics that would attempt to identify high-risk groups and low-risk groups. These statistics, which they have been gathering since January 1, 1985, have at least a diminished emphasis on the age, gender, and marital status criteria. and we would hope that with a sufficient accumulation of those criteria or those statistics, there may be an opportunity for rating criteria to be used that will not be quite the ones that are in use now.
Supplementary, Vermilion Viking.
Yes, to the Minister of Corporate and Consumer Affairs, could the Minister indicate if there's been any studies done to show that if you took the high-risk groups and averaged them into the general population, how much higher the average Albertan's insurance would be that are indeed in a good driving record or in a low-risk group?
Mr. Speaker, I don't have the precise percentage increase that would be incurred, but the Auto Insurance Board has advised me that an increase, and a perceptible increase, would indeed result, such that the majority of Albertans would be paying more if the suggestion were followed.
Leader of the Liberal Party.
Mr. Speaker, my question today is to the Premier. Earlier this year, Mr. Speaker, we learned how profitable it can be to be a former campaign manager for the Premier with the Les Mabbitt Olympia New York sweetheart deal. Now we read and hear that Vencap is making a $5 million investment in Mr. Al Olson's company, a former campaign chairman for the Premier, and his company called Stuart Olson Construction. Now, my question to the Premier, Mr. Speaker, is that according to Vencap officials, and quoted as saying that the $5 million investment will be used as working capital to support existing, quote, existing, unquote, activities and possible expansion. Now, can the Premier tell the Assembly how an investment that's supporting existing activities will support Vencap's mandate to diversify the economy?
Mr. Speaker, I have no knowledge of the investment that he's talking about.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I know the Premier isn't given to reading press, but he must watch TV or something, or check his library now and again. But for his information, Vencap has given $5 million to his former campaign chairman, an investment to support existing activities when Vencap has been authorized to diversify the economy. But has he no additional details as just what this taxpayers' money will be used for? Does he deny he has any knowledge?
That's right, Mr. Speaker.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I've heard of noblesse oblige, but this is Premier oblige, I guess. Well, would the Premier give the House the assurance, at least, in view of the fact that this appears to be a direct contravention of his company set up to invest in diversification, and appears to be out to pad another one of his campaign managers? Thank God there's many more of them around here. Would he covenant to the House that he will monitor this investment to see that it indeed goes into Vencap's legislated reason to be?
Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Minister of Economic Development and Trade may know something about this and may want to comment on it. Frankly, I find the innuendo from the Honourable Member completely unacceptable and another cheap action on his part.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, this is not innuendo. This is a direct attack, Mr. Premier, if you didn't understand that yet. I'm not trying to be subtle at all. Okay. Yeah. Mr. Speaker, will the Premier then assure the Assembly, or does he have any methods of controlling it, that a good part of this taxpayers' money won't leak back into the Conservative Party coffers as a donation?
Mr. Speaker, I would suggest that the Honourable Member, if he has any guts, he'd put something behind his hot air and make a case either inside or outside the House.
Honourable Member, with due respect, the Chair just is not here to defense anything other than the proper administration of the parliamentary process in the House. And along that line, the Chair requests the Honourable Member for Westlock Sturgeon to pull out his copy of Beauchesne and look at 359 subsection 7. The Chair recognizes the Leader of the Representative Party.
Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Provincial Treasurer. He has ventured to Ottawa and has, I'm sure, returned with some information with regards to new tax proposals. And my question, knowing that the Treasurer is unable to reveal the content of that information, but could the Provincial Treasurer indicate to this Assembly whether those proposals that will be presented on June the 18th will be firm proposals from the federal government and unchangeable following that date, or is there some means or mechanism by which there will be public discussion by which change can occur?
Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the member's understanding that any comments I make now with respect to tax reform places me in somewhat of a difficult position in that I now have fairly good information as to how and what will be involved and contained in the white paper released by the federal government, Mr. Wilson, next Thursday, June the 18th at 8 p.m., 6 p.m. Alberta. But I can say, Mr. Speaker, that first of all, we had an opportunity to be apprised of the elements of the tax proposals, both at the meeting with Mr. Wilson and at a previous meeting on Monday by the officials, wherein many of the details and the subtleties were explained to the participating governments. And secondly, there was a discussion about the process itself. And I think it's the process itself that is now a concern to my colleague from Littlebow. In that context, Mr. Speaker, it should be known that, in fact, some of the elements of the tax policy paper will be implemented on the day, June the 18th, but still others will be the subject of some broad discussion, and those others include, obviously, the impact of business transfer tax, value-added tax, whether or not the provinces will participate in a national sales tax of some order, and other elements of the tax which may impact on certain sectors. But nonetheless, Mr. Speaker, it's my view that there will be an opportunity for this sort of public discussion. I intend to seek advice of many groups in Alberta once the public is aware of the elements. And I would suspect, Mr. Speaker, that the Minister of Finance and the federal government will proceed with legislation through the fall of 1987 to implement those tax changes, particularly on the personal and corporate side for 1988 tax year.
Mr. Speaker, supplementary. The Minister has indicated that the province is preparing impact studies with regards to the various proposals. Is the Minister prepared to make a commitment at this time that those studies can be tabled in this legislature? Now, that means tomorrow possibly, but could they be made available through the summer to the members of the legislature if the session is not in
Mr. Speaker, I haven't come to any conclusion as to how we will disseminate information which we have. Frankly, one of the problems to date has been putting together our own database and evaluating the trends both on the personal and corporate side so we can come to some conclusion ourselves as to whether or not the federal tax proposals will impinge positively or negatively on Alberta, the sectors and the Alberta government, of course, but more particularly on the Alberta taxpayers. And in that discussion, I'm sure we have to examine the kinds of economic objectives which the government has pursued, the need for new investment in this province, the protection of the key sectors of our province, and whether or not these tax implications would cause any serious change in investment strategy by the private sector. All of those must be the elements which must be in everybody's mind as you look at tax changes of this order. Unfortunately, though, I will not be able to provide any information to the House tomorrow or Thursday until the federal minister makes his information available on Thursday at 8 p.m., as I noted. But on Friday, I'd be glad to pursue further in question period any elements of debate which may be available. Yet, should it be, on the slight chance that we are adjourned by Friday, that I would be then making available to the various sectors our information with respect to various impacts on certain sectors, and prompting, as I've indicated, discussion and advice from members of the private sector who would care to provide us with information. And then that will be focused back through both officials and ministerial meetings with Mr. Wilson.
Mr. Speaker, supplementary to the Minister, will it be the intent of the Minister to have some type of formal hearings through the province of Alberta with regards to those tax proposals, or will it be on an informal basis?
Mr. Speaker, I don't at this point have a recommendation. I'm probably not inclined to move in a formal way. But as I've indicated, I'm looking for all opportunities to discuss with various groups in Alberta the provisions of the tax legislation. Perhaps, Mr. Speaker, might be just helpful to recount what it was that started this trend. And the trend was initiated by the American adjustment, wherein they reduced the rates and broadened the tax base. And the original strategy by Mr. Wilson, as he outlined earlier in 1986, was to do that as well, to broaden the base and to reduce the tax rates, and then consider whether or not some sort of a business transfer tax would be an appropriate alternative mechanism to supplement the federal income. And I think we have to gauge it in that context as to whether or not these policies are applicable. And I think we'll have an opportunity probably Thursday night or Friday morning to discuss that more fully, Mr. Speaker.
Supplementary, Littlebow. Leader of the Opposition.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, recognizing that the Treasurer can't go into details, although he did say that some of the proposals would become law almost immediately, at least I understood him that, when this proposal comes out, and many of the others would be some sort of public consultation. Does the Minister have some idea about when, in fact, a lot of these proposals might become the law? Are we looking at the 1988 tax year, for example?
Mr. Speaker, it's my view that obviously what they will do is make some of the legislation retroactive. If they want to change certain elements of the tax proposals, they'll make them retroactive until Thursday night. But would bring legislation forward in the fall of 1988, if I understand Mr. Wilson's process, and that legislation would go to Parliament, would be passed and debated there, and would be effective for the 1988 tax year.
Calgary-Buffalo, supplementary.
Thank you. The Minister's comments in the House have basically focused on the business transfer tax, sales tax issues, although oil and gas, in fact, is far the most important interest that we have in this province. I'm wondering whether the Minister can tell this House what representations he has been making to the federal government to maintain these very important tax deductions that are at the foundation of the prosperity of this very risky industry.
Mr. Speaker, over the past year we have in fact outlined both at the officials level and the ministerial level, and including many representations from the Premier, the Minister of Energy and others on that very important issue to ensure that any significant changes in the tax industry does not detract from the investment opportunities which exist there and which are necessary there, and to ensure that the current regime, both on the tax and tax system, is applied fairly and perhaps equitably and consistently. And in that context, there's been some discussions about the elements of the tax regime. More recently, we've had discussions with respect to the so-called flow-through shares. Those elements are on the table. We've made representations with respect to the importance of certain tax regimes as they affect the synthetic development and heavy oil development, and those have been recognized, I think, in the policy considerations. And moreover, Mr. Speaker, we have outlined the importance of the oil industry, not just to Canada in terms of investment activity, but to all of Canada, because it does in fact generate economic growth and activity in all parts of Canada, as was evidenced by the significant investments in synthetic oil and other kinds of traditional oil through the 1970 period, when in fact much of the economic activity took place in other parts of Canada. So in terms of employment, a multiplier, and real investment, we view the oil and gas sector as an important one for Alberta and for Canada, and I made a series of very strong representations on that very point, both on the personal income tax side in terms of jobs, on the corporate side in terms of the regime it faces, and of course any possible elements of a change in the system with respect to business transfer tax or value-added tax has also been drawn to their attention.
Edmonton Strathcona.
Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Hospitals and Medicare and concerns the provincial laboratory. Mr. Speaker, yesterday I drew the Minister's attention to the fact that his department squandered, I think is not too strong a word, about $30 million for lab tests in private labs which could have been done in the provincial lab. This I pointed out in the wake of last week's report that lab fees had risen some 12%, when the Minister said the overall increase of 9.5% in the program was the trend I'm trying to stop. My question is, has the Minister now investigated this matter, and will he confirm that about half of the Alberta Healthcare Insurance Plan's expenditures on lab fees is in fact a complete waste of money?
Mr. Speaker, I have indicated in this House previously that we have formed a committee involving members of the Alberta Medical Association and staff in my department and the Alberta Hospital Association that will be looking into the question of how you limit the number of tests that might be ordered up by medical practitioners. And that is a much broader question than just who does the test, private sector labs, hospital labs, or the provincial lab. So that work is underway. It's long-term. It may take several months, or it may be an ongoing challenge to try to bring down the number of tests that are actually ordered. That's been a very fast-growing area of cost for all health care plans right across Canada. Insofar, Mr. Speaker, as the honourable member's comments about squandering funds, I would have to reject that as being something that's not yet being proven by either his statements in the House, Mr. Speaker, or by any other evidence we have. The only thing that I can say for certain with respect to the little research I've been able to do on this subject since yesterday is that the honourable member's news release that quoted certain costs of the provincial lab for doing certain tests was in certain areas entirely inaccurate and understated, and was done, I presume, in order to prove the point the honourable member wanted to make, but that doesn't help with the issue at all.
Well, it seems that for about $1.5 million more, one can put the provincial laboratory in a position to do half the tests currently being done. So it seems. But what steps will the minister now take to reverse the 40 million or so in cuts he imposed last month, now that we have pointed out to him where he can save some $30 million more?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I first of all want to, working with the Minister of Community and Occupational Health, do a thorough review of the honourable member's suggestions that there is the possibility of saving that amount of money. I doubt very, very much if anywhere near that amount could be saved, but I want to understand from studies that we will obviously have to undertake whether or not any funds can be saved by transferring existing lab work done by private labs to the provincial lab. There are all kinds of complications with that idea. For one, we would then be in a situation where you've got two labs in the entire province that were doing work that's now done by many, many laboratories which are scattered throughout the province. The waiting times would probably become intolerable for good medical care. There are perhaps a dozen other reasons why the socialist theory that the honourable member presents of having the government do everything and moving the private sector out of health care will not work. It's a very good theory, but it hasn't been proven in practice anywhere, and I think we need a little bit of practicality in the area of testing and laboratory work as well.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, the problem is that these tests are being done by the private laboratories right on the doorstep of the provincial laboratory, so it is practical to make the shift. And although there is room for argument about the cost, the relative cost, the margins are so very large from the information we have. I'm just wondering how it is the minister's never paused to wonder just a little at how his department pays private labs, in fact, such a considerable amount more than it would cost to have the test done at the provincial lab.
Well, for the third time today, I have to say to the honourable member that the cost figures that he presented yesterday in a news release, at least some of them that I've looked at, are entirely inaccurate. And I don't know where he got his information from, but he probably received it from somebody who has an interest in building the provincial laboratory into some grand edifice that doesn't exist now, and doing away with private labs. And let's have, Mr. Speaker, before we rush into that kind of a concept, let's have a rather independent look at it from both sides and not just accept the figures that have been provided by someone who's interested solely in developing a large, huge government laboratory in the constituency that the honourable member represents. I think that's probably the wrong way to go. I've said to the honourable member, I'm willing to check into it. I'll work with my colleague in Community and Occupational Health to see if there's any validity to the statements he makes. We're not prepared to exceed today that the direction of doing away with private labs and doing all of that work in one provincial government lab in Edmonton is the right way to go?
No, Mr. Speaker, I was suggesting the private labs should be done away with, but where practical, and assuming there are savings, then the test ought to go to the provincial laboratory. And I understand the Minister's scepticism about, thank you, Mr. Speaker, but I remind the Minister I put these figures before him last year, and I just wonder why it is that in the year that has passed, none of this study, apparently, that the Minister now says he is prepared to make, has been done.
Well, Mr. Speaker, first of all, we have a great number of hospital labs throughout this entire province that would be, in my opinion, much better equipped to take on some of the work that might now be being done by private labs than the provincial lab would be. I'm not interested, and I don't think very many in this government are, building a facility in the honourable member's constituency that's going to do the lab work for half of the province of Alberta. We're interested in efficiency and quickness in medical care, and that won't occur in terms of the direction the honourable member wants to go. In addition to that, Mr. Speaker, I say that the honourable member's figures that he provides are pulled from thin air somewhere. Nobody can possibly substantiate how one medical test can be done for 10 cents in a provincial lab and all the costs covered. God, it doesn't even cover it hardly covers 1/4 of the mailing costs of the results. So anybody who's read the news release of yesterday would know that there's a very biased opinion into the cost of tests that doesn't relate to reality at all. I don't even have to research that figure to know that it's dead wrong. So if the honourable member would like to provide some accurate figures, if he has any at his disposal, I'd be pleased to look at them. But I can't look at cost comparisons that are drawn from the figment of someone's imagination.
Vermilion Viking. Vermilion Viking. Supplementary.
Yes, supplementary, Mr. Speaker, to the Minister of Hospitals and Medical Care. In respect to the rising laboratory costs in the province, there's no doubt that the medical profession fears increasing liability, public liability and liability insurance. Could the Minister indicate what percentage of the rising lab costs are due to unnecessary calling for lab tests by the medical profession for fear of liability?
No, I can't indicate that, Mr. Speaker, except to say that medical practitioners indeed have expressed the concern that they feel they must order up additional tests and retests because of fear of liability in that area. And to what extent that results in actual costs, I don't know, but that's one thing I've asked the committee to look into to see if there isn't some way that can be resolved.
Calgary-Buffalo.
Sure, I was wondering whether the minister might be able to tell us why the statistics published by his department constantly lump together these high-income laboratories and other clinics rather than segregate them out from sole practitioners so that we can understand what the statistics mean and have some accurate information to make some judgments by.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable member would be pleased to know that I asked the same question myself.
Member for Vegreville, followed by Calgary-Buffalo, followed by Athabasca-Lac-La Biche.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Mulroney Conservatives are pushing hard to negotiate a comprehensive free trade agreement with the United States. While refusing to enter into meaningful debate on this issue and its implications for Albertans, these Lougheed leftovers play the role of eager cheerleaders for their cousins in Ottawa. My question is to the Minister of Agriculture. Is it this government's position that the regulated sectors of Alberta's agriculture industry like egg, poultry and milk production are not on the table for so-called free trade negotiations?
Mr. Speaker, I've indicated on a number of occasions, not only to the honourable member, but to the various boards and commissions that are affected, that everything is on the table for negotiation and discussion. But we feel quite confident that because of the mechanisms that the United States does have in place itself, that if there are to be any changes made to mechanisms within this country, it will take a good number of years and there will be something to offset whatever harm would be occurring to our our supply managed sectors within the province of Alberta or throughout Canada. In addition to that, I feel quite confident that there will not be major changes to those boards and commissions that presently do exist.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the minister seems to know more than the Premier, and in view of the fact that he's more willing to share with members of the Assembly what is and what is not negotiable, I'm wondering, can he tell us what other agricultural programs he's determined to protect in the long term for Alberta agriculture?
Mr. Speaker, I feel that I've answered that in a very thorough way in my original answer.
Well, it's about as vague as most of the answers we've been getting. The minister's referred in the past in this House to his desire to gain assured access for our red meat producers to the American market. And I'm wondering, is the minister prepared to negotiate for that very narrow and important arrangement in the context of a huge, comprehensive bilateral free trade agreement?
Mr. Speaker, I've indicated, as his government has indicated on a consistent basis, that we feel it's essential that we do have assured access for our red meat industry into the United States and for a number of our other agricultural products, because in the event that we don't, we know that the effect will be drastic on the agricultural sector within the province of Alberta, and that is why we're so anxious to make sure that we do have a very comprehensive trade agreement with the U.S.
Supplementary, Mr. Speaker. Does the minister have any concrete evidence to suggest that the Americans would not view as unfair production subsidies subject to countervailing duties various programs like Farming for the Future, Irrigation Rehabilitation and Expansion, Farm Credit Stability Program, Crow Benefit Offset Program, Farm Fertilizer Protection Plan, Crop Insurance Coverage Restoration Program, Trust Fund...
The honourable member wishes to read a whole encyclopedia. Minister of Agriculture.
Mr. Speaker, I'm delighted to see that the honourable member, when the session is winding down, is offering his warm congratulations to this government for our many worthwhile agricultural programs.
Honourable member hasn't been recognized. Member for Red Deer South, followed by the member for West Loch Sturgeon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Supplementary. I recognize that the Socialists opposite have their hands somewhat tied by people like Dave Whirlin and Shirley Carr on the matter of free trade, but could the Minister for Career Development indicate to us how many jobs are directly related in this province to exports that are being threatened at this time by protectionist laws in the United States?
Mr. Speaker, it's in Alberta. I believe that I do not know the exact number, but I know that there are hundreds of thousands of jobs, and a substantial portion of our gross domestic product in Alberta is directly related to free trade. And I can also indicate to the honourable member for Red Deer South that many of the woes that are creating higher unemployment in Europe are a result of contracted markets. Certainly, Mr. Speaker, we believe in Alberta that this is a tremendous opportunity not only for Alberta but to Canada, to trade our way out of unemployment.
Loch Sturgeon, supplementary.
Supplementary, Mr. Speaker. Back to the Minister of Agriculture. In view of the statement by the federal government that one of the things in the bilateral trade agreement is to encourage American investment in Canada, and in view of the fact that as the Premier stated the other day, there are regulations in Alberta to stop or try to control foreign ownership of our farmlands or recreational properties. Has there been any pressure or any discussions between the Minister and his federal counterparts for the Alberta government to relax or to do away with any restrictions on investment by Americans in our farmland and in our recreational lands in Alberta?
No, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Calgary Buffalo, followed by Athabasca Lac-La-Biche.
Thank you. This is to the Minister of Social Services as well. On Saturday, April the 11th, the minister stated that within 2 weeks she would announce a strategy to deal with the plight of abused women and children. 2 months later, all we've had are announcements of bed closures for women's shelters in Calgary. And now we find that there are plans to reduce the number of beds available for abused children in Calgary. I wonder whether the minister could tell this House why the government is moving to reduce the number of shelter beds for abused children from 44 run by the city to 36 run by private interests, effective at the end of June, despite complaints of social service crisis workers that they can't handle the load as is. Is this part of the all-out attack on family violence?
Mr. Speaker, I think that if the honourable member has been paying attention in the House, that he will have heard time and time the discussion with respect to the Child Welfare Act, and it is our belief, and I went into it extensively in going over the estimates of the Department of Social Services, that children are far better served within their family setting with assistance early on, as opposed to taking them away from the family after the crisis has reached a proportion that is necessary.
Well, the crisis workers are telling me there is no money for assistance. Will the minister tell this House what strategy she had in mind on April the 11th and what has evolved since then to deal effectively with the problem of abused women and children, and whether it will include programs for men who are abusers, coordination between police and prosecutors, and a number of other initiatives that are obvious if there's a will to act?
Mr. Speaker, the honourable member is really mixing two different programs. In the first instance, I believe he would be referring to comments that I have made with respect to working with community organizations in a program that will be coming forward that deals with family violence. But with respect to the crisis intervention and the type of beds that are necessary for dealing with children in this particular situation, that's a different program altogether. And, Mr. Speaker, we are doing earlier intervention with families to prevent children from needing that type of accommodation.
Well, that's what we keep hearing, is there are different programs when we need coordination. There was a reference to a strategy. Now, we have the closure of the 20 women's shelter beds in Calgary, and I'm wondering whether the minister can tell this House how much more it's going to cost the Department of Social Services to put these women up in motels and hotels without any form of consultation and counseling than it would to keep them in.
Please, honourable member, that question is out of order. It's already been asked earlier in this question period today. There's been more than enough latitude having these questions come up on sequential days. The time for question period has expired. Might we have unanimous consent to complete this series of questions? Opposed? Member for Calgary Buffalo, final supplementary, but staying away from women's emergency shelters, please.
I can't ask. Is the Speaker telling me that I cannot ask a question with respect to women's emergency shelters in Calgary?
That is correct, honourable member. I trust your hearing as good as anyone else in this chamber.
Cannot ask any questions with respect to women's emergency shelters? Well, I'd ask a point of order on that, certainly. Finally, might I ask the minister with respect to the cost of these programs, since we're losing $150,000 a month in this province for failure to access federal cap funding. And can the minister tell this House why the government won't commit some of this federal money or indeed some lottery funds to deal with this serious problem of family abuse?
Mr. Speaker, once again, the honourable member is showing his complete lack of understanding with respect to the children that we're talking about serving under that particular program area. The children that were served, and it's now the program was tendered out, formerly handled by Calgary Social Services, are children. Some of them need secure treatment. They are troubled children. These children are not the ones that arrive with their mothers at the shelters in that particular crisis situation. And, Mr. Speaker, once again, I would say, to remind the honourable member, last year he will recall that special funding was made available in the City of Calgary. I believe that the amount was over $300,000 for community organizations to develop programs for the special treatment of children in this type of situation. Mr. Speaker, I believe that the programs that come forward on the basis of their relative success are the ones that in the end will be supported in the long term. Certainly there has been additional funding allocated, and Mr. Speaker, I hope that the honourable member, possibly with a visit to my office, can be given an understanding of the two areas that we're talking about.
Supplementary, Edmonton Avonmore. All the questions have been asked, honourable members.
Mr. Speaker, to the Minister, what assurances and what steps has she taken to ensure that abused children that are returned home in the name of protecting and holding the family intact are not subjected to further abuse and sometimes injury and death?
Mr. Speaker, the people who work in this area are particularly dedicated, well-skilled, and well-educated. And it would only be on the advice of those individuals who work in that area that children would be returned to that particular situation. Mr. Speaker, if those professionals don't believe that the children are safe, that they would be at risk, they will not be returned.
Member for Red Deer North.
Supplementary, Mr. Speaker. One of the tragic, to the Minister of Social Services, one of the tragic ironies of women being battered is that it's the women and children who have to flee the home while the man gets to stay. Has the Minister been in discussion with the Attorney General to see that men who are convicted of battering are forbidden to return home until they have taken compulsory treatment programs?
Mr. Speaker, as I understand it, there have been some suggestions over the last several years in that respect. I'm not sure whether it would come under the criminal code. I suspect it would. Certainly, if there is leeway for that type of judgment to be made in courts, I would hope that it would be seriously looked at.
Time for question period has expired. Orders of the day. Honourable Member for Calgary Buffalo.